And we're going to stay, in fact, on the topic of those judicial reform protests in Israel. In business news, Charles Pellegrini is with me here on set. Charles, what has been the impact of this movement on the economy in Israel so far?
Well, Stuart, it depends on what indicators you look at, obviously, but so far the economic impact in the present is limited, but there is a sense of uncertainty about the future. Looking at economic growth, for instance, the Central Bureau of Statistics revised its estimate for GDP growth in the first quarter of the year to 3.1% compared to a previous estimate of 2.5%. And the Bank of Israel actually raised its forecast for the whole of 2023 by 0.5%, leading to an annual growth of 3%, which is double the OECD average. On top of that, indicators on business confidence and employment are also still positive. Just like the rest of the world, though, Israel's economy is struggling with inflation and high interest rates, which in turn are hurting consumer spending. But according to many economists, the situation is made worse in Israel because its currency, the shekel, has slumped against the US dollar over concerns regarding the judicial reform controversy. Toward the end of January, as you see on this graph, one US dollar trended for about 3.3 shekels, and today it's closer to 3.7 shekels. This uncertainty has also affected Israeli stocks, which have also overall slumped since the start of the year.
So, Charles, what are the actual concerns then that the business community has about the reform?
Well, the country's tech sector, which represents about 15% of its GDP and about half of the country's exports, is one of those leading the charge against the reform plans. Many of those companies are based in the more liberal city of Tel Aviv, where most of those who oppose Netanyahu's ruling coalition are based. And many companies are giving employees the day off to protest, for instance. The worry is that giving the government more control over the courts opens the door for more government control and oversight on businesses. This, in turn, could make members of the ruling coalition more vulnerable to corruption, for instance. There's also concern that this will lead to a right-wing political turn that will scare away investment and talent away from Israel. A number of Israeli tech firms announced that they are moving funds and operations abroad as a hedge against the judicial reform passing, and making plans for the future is complicated in this context. Investments in Israeli startups in the first quarter of 2023 fell by 15%, when they've actually gone up 34% and 15% in the US and Europe, respectively, for the same period.
Let's move on with some other business news now. We're going to tell you what's happening on the stock markets.
Yeah, markets in Europe opening slightly higher as investors await key data from the United States on inflation later in the day, which will have an impact, obviously, on the Federal Reserve's thinking when it comes to interest rate hikes. You can see the FTSE in London up 0.4%, the DAX in Frankfurt up just short of 1/3%, and the Paris CAC 40 up 1/3%. We saw some mixed trading in Asia this Wednesday. The Nikkei in Tokyo closing the session down 0.8%. Same goes for the Shanghai Composite. The Hang Seng in Hong Kong and the Kospi in Seoul, though, both trending higher, with the Kospi up 0.5%.
Now we're going to talk about China on the programme for you. The economy there has not bounced back as strongly as expected, said ending its 3 years of COVID restrictions.
Its zero COVID policy has left the youth in the country with fewer options. Youth unemployment actually stands at 20.8%, meaning people are now turning to street hawking to make ends meet. Yinka Oyetade has a story.
Pahati is on a quest to draw potential customers to his lemon tea stand on the outskirts of Shanghai. The 27-year-old just started his new business after seeing young and successful hawkers on social media. Opening the stand was never part of Pahati's career plan, but the lifting of China's zero COVID policy hasn't spurred major recovery, and youth unemployment is mounting.
If you live in a big city like Shanghai, your rent is a big part of your expenses. If you can earn enough through hawking to cover your rent, I think that's great.
Young people are bearing the brunt of China's tepid recovery. Nearly 21% were jobless in May, another record high. Local authorities are now loosening street hawking rules after a decade of strict regulation.
Allowing hawkers to hit the street is among the policy options to spur consumption and to stabilize the job market.
After closing her flowers store during the pandemic, this 52-year-old woman has been unable to secure another full-time job. She's now moved her business to this street corner, where she's forced to compete with younger vendors.
Young people in general, especially young women, really like flowers. So they want to start selling them on the street for fun. But what they don't realize is that someone's actual livelihood depends on this business.
Shanghai says it will hold a trial period letting authorized street vendors set up shop in designated locations from August 5th. That will be in exchange for registration and a fee.
And that's it for my business segment so far.
Thank you very much. Charles Pellegrin with the business news.